Thank you for inviting me, Marco and Fabrizio. I'm very happy to kick off this event. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to start off this morning by talking about embodiment, about its structure, and a little bit about its mechanisms. So what's embodiment? Embodiment is the distinctive way a subject inhabits her body. Descartes, he observed that we are not in our bodies like pilots are in ships. What did he mean by that? We feel our bodies from the inside. We have proprioception in our body. We feel pain and we feel hunger. And the body has a special role in perception and in action. Now, the question of embodiment I want to raise is this. How does a subject have to relate to her body so as to constitute paradigm embodiment? And by this, I mean full-fledged embodiment in the good case in healthy, neurologically normal adult human individuals. So the question is how does a subject have to relate to her body so as to constitute paradigmatic embodiment? Another way to phrase the question is beginning with this metaphor that we had from Descartes is how does a subject have to inhabit her body so as to not be in her body as a pilot is in a ship? So this is the key question that I want to answer. One way to see that this question has significance is to notice that there are ways of losing one's body. What are these? So there are various pathologies of bodily action, such as paralysis when someone has a stroke, locked-in syndrome when, for example, one has brainstem damage so that one can no longer move one's peripheral muscles, or cases of anarchic hand syndrome, for example, when patients have a lesion in the supplementary motor area or the pre-supplementary motor area. These patients are no longer able to properly voluntarily control one of the hands. Typically, the hand gets drawn into various environmental affordances and performs involuntary movements which are purposive but involuntary. So these are various ways of not being able to act with one's body or losing the ability to completely control one's body. So we have pathologies of bodily action. We also have pathologies of bodily experience. So after a stroke and damage, say, to the primary somatosensory area, certain kinds of patients will experience numbness in parts of their body. In more serious cases, say peripheral deafferentation, when you have the afferent nerves being destroyed in parts of one's body, then you have peripheral deafferentation. These patients will, for example, lose touch proprioception in certain parts of their body that are deafferented. Yet another kind of pathology of bodily experience are these out-of-body experiences. So in these cases, which are far and few, you have patients experiencing out-of-body experiences. What they feel is they float outside of their body and look back at their biological body. There are various forms of this, and often these patients have vestibular disorders. So these are cases of pathologies of bodily experience. In both cases of pathologies of bodily action and of bodily experience, what we have are ways of partially being disembodied. So if there are ways of losing one's body, then there are also ways of inhabiting one's body so that one is properly embodied in paradigm embodiment. And that's what I want to get at. And in pursuing this project, there are a number of methodological remarks I want to make before we start. The first remark is that I'm interested in actual human embodiment, not the embodiment of any possible creature, but of our embodiment. And within that, there's a further restriction that in the core case, we want to articulate the embodiment of normal, neurologically normal adult human individuals. We want to capture the core of that. Secondly, it's important to note that what's key here in giving an account of embodiment, in the sense that we're after, is the shape of the account rather than the specific details of the formulation. So my aim would be to get the general structure right, rather than to convince you to agree with me on each of the details that I will specify in formulating the account. So it's the shape that's important here. Third remark is the role of pathologies. Pathologies have a distinctive role here because in inhabiting our body, the normal function and phenomenology of our body is so familiar and taken for granted that it's hard to articulate. It's hard to articulate what exactly is the normal function and phenomenology of embodiment. One can see this because it took scientists a very, very, very long time to get to even talking about proprioception. So the first systematic account of proprioception we have articulated in the neuroscience text is from Sherrington, from about 100 years ago. So if proprioception itself is already so hard to notice and talk about, then what more other aspects of embodiment as well? So pathologies then become very important here, because if you have various ways of losing your body, then these illuminate what the paradigm case is by illustrating various departures from the paradigm case. So they bring out normal function and phenomenology by illustrating departures. Fourth point is that the account that I'll be giving in each of the conditions, and as the whole of the conditions put together, will be a graded account. It's quite unlike classical accounts in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, because you don't want to say, I think, in these cases, that if one of the conditions is not met, then you're not embodied at all. What you want to say is that a subject is embodied in a certain body to the extent that he or she fulfills certain conditions. So the account will have a graded character. Finally, what I'm interested in giving is a constitutive account. It's not primarily an account of the mechanisms, rather it's an account of the structure and the nature of embodiment. I will allude to some of the mechanisms that are critical for embodiment. And also, it's not a developmental account. I think we are still at the earliest stages of understanding how we develop in a way such that we can inhabit our bodies, as we do in the normal healthy case. And this is interesting, but will not be what I will be focusing on. I will be focusing on trying to give the shape of a constitutive account. So those are the methodological preliminaries, and back to our question. Our question is, how does the subject need to inhabit her body in order to be embodied in it? And by embodiment, I mean experiential embodiment. It's a new question that is being posed, distinct from various metaphysical questions that philosophers have posed in the past. For example, the so-called mind-body problem, which is a question about how, in the Cartesian sense, how a subject can causally connect with the body. I'm not interested in that question, but rather in this experiential question of how a subject needs to inhabit her body so as to be embodied in it. How a subject needs to be in her body so she's not in her body like a pilot is in a ship. And I take it from the indication we saw from ways of losing one's body that there are phenomenological and functional consequences of embodiment. The approach will be to articulate normal function and phenomenology partly by way of directly considering the normal case and partly by examining pathologies. And with that, we will get at paradigm embodiment. Okay. So let's begin. At the core of the account is the ability to act and perceive with one's body. I think these are the two great halves of cognition, as it were, of our mental lives. Being able to act and being able to perceive through and with one's body. And this is at the center of the account that we find from Sidney Shoemaker and John Foster, two philosophers who have considered the question before. So an action condition would look like this. You might say that a subject is agentially embodied in a certain body to the extent that she can intentionally act with that body. So you don't only need to act with the body, but you need to be able to control it in certain ways intentionally so that the body can be a way of fulfilling your intention so that you have voluntary control. So that's the action condition. A further thing here might be to add a sense of agency condition so that you are agentially embodied in a certain body, not only to the extent that you can act with that body, but to the extent that you can intentionally act with that body and know that you are so acting in at least core cases. So that's the action condition. The perception condition is as follows. A subject is perceptually embodied in a certain body to the extent that the interactions of that body with its surroundings result in her having veridical experiences of the surroundings. So in this case, we're concerned with exteroception, that is perception of the external environment. So subject is perceptually embodied in a certain body to the extent that you can perceive your surroundings accurately with that body. And similarly to the action condition, where you might think that a sense of agency or knowledge of agency might be part of this, you might add a perceptual knowledge condition here, where you say that you're embodied in a certain body to the extent that interactions of that body with surroundings result in you having veridical experiences of the surroundings that puts you in a position to have perceptual knowledge of your surroundings. So we can see that these two sides capture a large extent of our mental lives, of the mental lives of creatures, that we have action on the one side and perception on the other side. Notice that these conditions, as have been specified, are not necessary and sufficient conditions, but a kind of graded condition because of the phrase to the extent. So you are agentially embodied or perceptually embodied in a certain body to the extent that you satisfy a certain kind of condition. So it's graded. Okay, question. So now we have at the core agential and perceptual embodiment. Question, is that enough? So Shoemaker and Foster said that all we need for embodiment is just satisfying the agential and perceptual conditions, and that is embodiment simpliciter. Is that enough? No, I think we can see it's not enough when we think of the role of the body in emotion. So besides acting and perceiving through one's body, we also have affect in our bodies. And emotion and emotional expression critically involves a kind of embodiment. So I think one key aspect of embodiment not covered by perception and action is affect. There are four key aspects I want to consider. The first is emotional expression, where this involves gesture, voice, facial and bodily expression, and certain involuntary aspects of emotional expression. Secondly, in affective embodiment, we also have desire. Desire often involves various somatic manifestations that involve bodily affect. Third, if we think about the role of the erotic in our mental lives, this is certainly deeply embodied. Fourth, new area of haptics that people have just gotten into is the role of affective touch. This is touch that is light and involves a different set of receptors from usual touch, which has been studied, deep and light touch. And affective touch involves critically affective elements that are different from usual somatosensory input. So if it's true that we have all these four key aspects, these are aspects which involve the body deeply but are not yet covered by perception and action. Now, let's see this by considering the case of emotional expression, both in gesture and in facial and bodily expressions. So let's consider Ekman's 6 basic emotions: anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happiness, sadness. Here in front of you on the slides, you see the canonical expressions of these emotions. Now, whether or not you have an account of emotion where the bodily expression is a constitutive element of emotion, bodily expression is going to be extremely closely connected to the emotion. So the line on affective embodiment I'm running does not require you to say that bodily expression is part of emotion or a constitutive element of emotion. As long as you acknowledge that bodily expression is very closely tied to emotion and affect, you will have the point. One way to see that it's important is that in cases of facial paralysis, say Moebius syndrome, patients report that they have a flattening of affect and that they have a kind of restriction on their ability to express themselves. So in a way, this is a way of being partially disembodied, when you are unable to express yourself through facial expression of emotion. If that's so, then we can think that in the normal case, bodily expression of emotion is a critical part of being embodied. It is part of being able to express affect and emotion through your body, through voice, through gesture, through facial expression, and so on. I think that's also very clear with the cases of, say, the erotic or affective touch, where it's very clear that there is a somatic element which is deeply connecting to the affective element. So in all these cases, you have an intertwining of affect with its expression in the body or with some kind of bodily aspect. In order to codify that, we can add a certain affect condition to the action and perception condition. So we can say that a subject is affectively embodied in a certain body to the extent that affective mental states are reflected in bodily changes in this very body, and these bodily changes are experienced without any phenomenology of alienation. I will come to the phenomenology of alienation later in discussing cases like Cotard syndrome. Now, it's important to notice that in formulating the affect condition, I've weakened this so that I'm talking of affective mental states being reflected in bodily changes in a certain body, which the subject is effectively embodied in. In certain cases, one can speak of something which is stronger than this, not merely reflection in these bodily cases or changes or the causation of bodily changes, but rather that affective mental states are expressed in these bodily changes. So if one can speak of that, then there is a closer tie. So here we have a action position, condition, a perception condition, and an affect condition. And once again, the question arises, do agential, perceptual, and affective embodiment capture paradigm embodiment? Is that enough for us? And as expected, no, this is not enough. And why is it not enough? This is because we feel our bodies from the inside. We have proprioception in our bodies, among other things. And this is not yet captured through the agential, perceptual, and affective conditions. Because remember the perceptual condition that we had earlier was a condition on exteroception, the accuracy of exteroception and its ability to deliver perceptual knowledge. So one way of seeing this is by looking at pathological cases. So we have the case of deafferented agents, such as the famous patient Ian Waterman, who you see here on the slide. He experienced a kind of a viral neuropathy, which basically destroyed his afferent nerves from the collarbone line down. So he then experienced widespread loss of proprioception in touch in all these areas. He still has intact pain in these areas. So after the loss of proprioception and touch, initially there was a complete loss of control, and he was not even able to sit, and certainly not able to act, even with limbs such as his hands and so on. So he might try to lift a certain limb and something else would happen. Maybe he tries to act with his left hand and his left leg comes up. But he learned to act again using visual attention to recalibrate the sensory motor control. And after a kind of a long recovery and rehabilitation period, he relearned how to walk. But it's critical that his action is quite different from ours. He has to visually attend to his effectors as he acts. If you switch off the lights when he is acting, when he is in a room, he actually slumps to the floor. He can't even stand. Now, so in contrast with Ian Waterman, we can feel our bodies from the inside, and we can use this to both control our action and have a sense of our body in terms of knowing where our limbs are and so on. Besides proprioception, bodily awareness also encompasses a large range of other internal information channels. So we have proprioception, the position and movement of one's body. Nociception, we have pain perception. We know that in cases of people who don't have pain perception, this endangers their survival, and this is a critical aspect of our well-being as well. And conversely, people who have chronic pain problems also have huge problems with their body. Another aspect is interoception, the perception of visceral states such as the perception of hunger, whether your bladder is full, your heartbeat, and so on and so forth. And finally, we have the vestibular sense, the sense of balance. So these are various forms of bodily awareness from the inside that tell you only about yourself. And this is not captured by the action perception or affect conditions. So we need to add a further condition. We call this a condition of internal embodiment. A subject is internally embodied in a certain body to the extent she has veridical experiences of her body and its states from the inside. So now we have 4 conditions, and we can once again ask whether embodiment consists in action, perception, affect, and bodily awareness. Is that enough? Not quite. Why is that so? Because there's a sort of higher order, more complex sense of awareness that we have of our bodies that is known as the sense of body ownership. Now I think if you have action, perception, affect, and bodily awareness, but no body ownership, there is a sense in which you are not having paradigm embodiment. So in the time that I have, it's impossible to go through the ownership literature, which is quite complex in itself. But I want to just very quickly sketch out my own view of ownership. I think there are 2 elements which are important. The first element is that ownership involves a kind of notion of self-significance that critically involves some notion of the they say. And I think if we have the notion of self-significance, there's a way in which this captures all the different strands in the ownership debate. The second thing is that we need the absence. When we have ownership of one's body, we need to have the absence of alien affect. Because what you have in certain cases of Cotard syndrome and depersonalization and derealization syndrome is that the subjects feel that they have a certain kind of alien affect in their body, and that is what leads them to have the sense that the body that they inhabit is not really theirs. So you need the absence of alien affect as well. So these are two elements, self-significance and absence of alien affect. But where do we find ownership in ordinary, everyday instances? Now, one aspect in which ownership is expressed comes from observations by people like Brian O'Shaughnessy and Michael Martin, when we look at the location of bodily sensation and its phenomenology. So when you feel a certain itch or pain and so on, and these are located bodily sensations, so we're only interested in the cases of located bodily sensations, you don't only feel the pain or the itch to be located, but you feel it to be located in a part of your body, within your bodily boundaries. So that seems to be part of the phenomenology of bodily sensation, that in the normal case, any way of feeling a located bodily sensation is a way of feeling it to be located within your bodily boundaries. But this can be lost. So in cases of somatoparaphrenia, where patients have right hemispheric lesions often, you have denial of ownership of a certain part of the body. So here's an instance of a patient who says that her hand is not actually her hand, but belongs to her husband. So here's the experimenter talking to the patient. Close your eyes and tell me what you feel when I'm touching your hand, patient says. That's not my hand. It's not mine. Someone left it there. I don't know who he was. I don't know who attached it to my body. So this is a case of somatoparaphrenia. And we know from a recent work on the rubber hand illusion that this is something that you can induce, so that we have a sense that we have a positive demonstration of the existence of this sense of ownership. There are questions of how this connects in to the normal experience of ownership, because obviously owning a rubber hand is nothing like the normal sense of ownership. Now, the rubber hand paradigm can be extended to the full body case. Similarly, what you do is you have synchronous stroking of an avatar and of your own body. You're looking at the avatar through some kind of head-mounted display, and when that happens, subjects report that they experience a sense of ownership over the avatar. So this is the full body illusion that was run by Binia Lagenhager at the Blanca lab. So what we have here is a demonstration that the sense of body ownership can be lost in somatoparaphrenia. It can be induced in certain cases, and that since it can be lost, we can think that this is a key aspect of normal, ordinary experience, as we can see, for example, in looking at the phenomenology of located bodily sensation. Given these things, I want to suggest that we can have a two-level account of body ownership. It doesn't matter if you don't agree with my two-level account of body ownership, as long as you think that body ownership is an aspect which is not explained by the conditions before and is an important aspect of embodiment, then you will agree with me that there has to be an ownership condition, regardless of whether you agree with my account. But the account here just gives you a sense of what could go into an account of body ownership. So in my own account of body ownership, I think there are two levels. At the first level are certain experiences of ownership, and this can be non-conceptual, can come from various non-conceptual sources. And what is crucial is the notion that these are self-specific experiences of one's body. Now, what do I mean by self-specificity here? What I mean is that these experiences have immediate implications for action. By immediate implications for action, I mean the contrast between the case, for example, when you consider the difference between seeing that man's trousers are on fire versus seeing that my own trousers are on fire. Even if when I judge that I see that man's trousers are on fire, I'm actually seeing myself in the mirror. Now, it's only in the case where I see that my trousers are on fire that it has the kind of structure of immediate implications for action, because it is self-specific. So this is the kind of case that we're familiar with from Perry and from Kaplan and so on. And I think as long as you have the structure of self-specificity in the experience, you have something like the experience of ownership. This is open to further analysis, but this, I think, is the first level of ownership. At the second level, what you have is judgments of ownership. So once you have these self-specific experiences of ownership, you can have first-person content explicitly through the self-attribution of these experiences. You can judge explicitly that this is my limb, this is my body, and so on and so forth. So this is a two-level account of ownership. Now, as I said earlier, there's also an alien affect condition, because problems arise when alien affect accompanies normal mental processes. So in Cotard syndrome, you experience a number of different kinds of, patients experience a number of different kinds of delusions. They have desomatization delusions, such as the denial of having a body. They have dementalization delusions. And they have death and non-existence delusions. This is all very radical. And the standard two-factor account of monothematic delusions explains this via two factors. The first factor is some kind of weird experience, namely some kind of alien affect, for example. And the second factor is that there is some kind of weird rationalization as well. So I want to focus here on the first aspect. When you have a weird experience, you have some kind of alien affect. So one way of being disembodied is through there being alien affect. So we need to rule that out in the normal case, that embodiment requires that you don't have these kinds of alien affect. Now, another aspect which is important is the aspect of the vestibular system in full body embodiment. So one way that can be brought out is by looking at autoscopic phenomena, and in particular the kinds of outer body experiences that I mentioned earlier in the beginning. Now, often these disorders also come with disorders of, so these are disorders of self-location in effect, because you locate yourself somewhere else other than where your biological body is. They also come with disorders of ownership, and typically involve disruptions to the areas which are typically identified as the human vestibular cortex. So what you have in these cases is that you have vestibular disruptions entering into disruptions of ownership. So you might think here that this provides further evidence that ownership is a part of paradigm embodiment, because we don't have this kind of out-of-body experiences in paradigm embodiment. So we have an ownership condition here, as I hope to have convinced you. And this condition says that a subject has a sense of ownership over a certain body, the entire body, to the extent that she has self-specific experiences of her body. This is my first level of ownership, in the absence of any phenomenology of alienation. This is the absence of alienation condition. So these, I think, are the 5 key conditions on core embodiment. And it's important to note that these conditions may not be satisfied in all agents. That is why you are embodied in a certain body to the extent that all these conditions are satisfied. And agents might have perception but no ability to act, and yet have intact affect, bodily awareness, and bodily ownership. Say an agent who has become paralyzed through a stroke. And one question you can ask is, are there specific conditions here that are extremely important? So you might think that in the phenomenology of inhabiting a certain body, all these conditions are equally important. But when you don't have a sense of ownership over a certain body part or over the entire body, as in certain cases of out-of-body experience patients, then something important is missing. So you might think the body ownership condition is very special here. One way to bring that out is to think of the case of a film subject from John Campbell. So this is a case that John Campbell used against P.F. Strawson's account of consciousness and self-consciousness as a sense of seeing oneself as the locus of certain perception and action. Now, what Campbell posed against this account was that, well, you could be like a film subject. So if you have a perfect kind of film experience where you can both experience external environment and also act on it, you might just treat this entire show as a kind of film and not feel that this is your experience in a way. Now you can augment this kind of case from Campbell with proprioception and bodily awareness, and also so you can augment this action and perception condition with this ability to feel your body from the inside, and ask whether ownership is important here. Now, to the extent that you don't feel an ownership, the sense of ownership over the body, you will not feel that you are inhabiting that very space. So the film subject example can be used to show that the ownership is particularly important, because even if you have action, perception, and bodily awareness, you might still feel that all this is just a kind of show. It has nothing to do with you. There is things, I can intervene on things here. I can perceive things here. I can feel from the inside, but this is just a particularly elaborate video game. It has nothing to do with me. So you might think that ownership here is extremely important. Now, before I end, I just want to turn very quickly to mechanisms on embodiment. So, insofar as we have the action and perception conditions, these mechanisms will be simply the mechanisms of action and perception. So, for example, the motor system and also various perceptual systems, vision, audition, and so on and so forth. And affect will involve the entire affective system. Now, bodily awareness and bodily ownership will involve certain kinds of aspects which scientists have certainly discussed recently. So, from the Morsley group, together with their colleagues Galace and Spence, they have come up with this idea of the body matrix, that where you go from basic somatosensory areas and also interoception right up to the notion of body ownership, both the notion of ownership of parts and also the ownership of one's whole body. And a more classical model we can have from Dickerman and DeHaan, who have applied the kind of dwell sensory systems model from the visual system to the case of somatosensory processing pathways. So you have these areas in the posterior parietal cortex and also the insula, where you have mechanisms underlying body schema, which is body aspects for action, and also body image, which is more visualized, more somatic, conscious aspects of somatosensation. So, putting that all together, we have a picture of paradigm embodiment. And paradigm embodiment involves action, perception, affect, bodily awareness, and body ownership. And when an agent has all these conditions satisfied, then he or she is in a state of paradigm embodiment. And an agent is embodied fully in a body to the extent that he or she satisfies all these conditions. So to wrap up, we now have a picture of the embodied subject, and this has a certain kind of functional significance. If we look at this picture of embodiment, it will tell us something about the self, about action, perception, and self-awareness, and how they are integrated, because we can look at the conditions and now look at how they can interact, come apart, and how they come apart to produce the kind of embodied subject that we are familiar with. They also have a phenomenological significance. They come together to give us a sense of ourselves. And with that, we have a picture of paradigm embodiment. Thank you.